Okay, I'll start recording now.
I would like, yeah.
Okay, to our viewers, this is a recording of decolonial dialogues between me and Ramon Brosfogel, members of the Decolonial International Network Foundation. My name is Sandew Hira, which is my pen name. My real name is Devaburam. I live in Holland, The Hague. I am from Suriname, a former colony of Holland in South America, who became independent in 1975. I came with my family from Suriname to Holland. During my secondary school, I became active in the anti-imperialist movement. From my 17 years onwards, 17. Part of the Trotskyist movement, then left the Trotskyist movement after the revolutions in Nicaragua and Grenada. I was president of the Grenada Solidarity Campaign. More than 10 years ago, I met Ramon Brosfogel. It was in a period where I was looking for other theories of liberation, and then came across with decolonial theory, and basically spent the last 10 years studying decolonial theories and developing it in the greater framework. And the Decolonial International Foundation was set up by Ecological Global, led by Ramon Brosfogel, International Institute for Scientific Research in The Hague, of which I'm a director, and the Islamic Human Rights Commission, of which Asum Irali and Mashu Shadare are the leading members. And they are also members of the board of the DIN Foundation. The series of videos goes into decolonial theory. So let my brother Ramon introduce himself now.
Yeah, thank you, Dew. My name is Ramon Brosfogel. I've been an activist for a long time against colonialism because basically I was born in a colony of the USA and it's still a colony of the USA today. And the struggle, I began those struggles myself. I got involved since I was a teenager. And so since then, I've been involved in this project of decolonization. However, after getting into issues related to the question of coloniality, decoloniality, all of that came out of the struggles in Puerto Rico, at least for me, it brought me into a struggle that is broader than just the decolonization from colonial administration. I start, in our view of decoloniality, we understand that colonial relations are broader than just a colonial administration. It's about coloniality of power, coloniality of being, coloniality of nature, over nature, coloniality of knowledge. And so the decolonization project is a broader project. And so later I became a professor at University of California, Berkeley. I've been there for 2 decades, and I've been involved in many of the struggles and institutions that you just mentioned, including the Decolonial International Foundation. And we're doing these dialogues because you and I have been talking informally for a long time, for hours. And we got to a point where we said we should share these dialogues because there's a lot of long conversations of many issues that we felt, despite our, not having clarity in some of the issues, we might be more clear about some of them, but there are others we were not clear. And so despite that, we wanted to share these conversations in public because we thought that it might be useful for other people to join this kind of questions and also intervene at some point in this kind of questions that we're developing and that are right now unfinished, without conclusion yet, and that we are in the initial process of imagining a decolonial world or a new civilization, the foundations for a new civilization. We're in that process, and it's not just us, it's many other people around the world, but we think that this kind of conversation should be shared rather than having it in private, informal conversation between you and I.
Yes, because Ramon is organizing the decolonial summer schools in different parts of the world, Ramon. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we have a decolonial summer school for the past 12 years now. We've been 12 years doing this. Every year, annual decolonial summer schools in many parts of the world. We have in Latin America, we have in Africa, we have in Asia, we have in Europe. And so there are many, and so we are very active in these decolonial summer schools where we have had contact with people from all over the world, and we have, in a sense, learned a lot about what decoloniality means in different contexts. That is not the same. That are not the same. That do not have necessarily the same, historical trajectory or the same social, political, economic conditions. So this is where it has forced us to learn and to think about decoloniality in a more pluriversal way because of the nature of the different struggles around the world.
Yes, and I remember that we meet until Corona crisis, we met annually in Granada and Barcelona, and which is in June and July, and in London with the Islamic Human Rights Commissions in January. But especially in Granada and Barcelona, we have time to discuss theoretical issues from the early morning to the late night, and between all the hours of the organizational things that needs to be done for the summer schools, the lectures, sometimes I participate in or I give, and the lecturers give. And a lot of these theoretical discussions revolve around the idea, how do you build a coherent, integrated framework for decolonial theory? So if you're talking about an integrated and coherent decolonial theory, you figure out which other theories could you look into which are coherent and integrated. And if you look into knowledge production, in my view, two frameworks can carry that label of being integrated and coherent, which is liberalism and Marxism, because they had a political theory, an economic theory, social theory, cultural theory, a theory of what kind of society do you want to build, and they provided basic concepts in the different fields of science and created a coherent worldview. Now, regarding decoloniality, there are many contributions that have been done in the last few decades, specifically in the theoretical field, but conceptually, of course, many people have contributed to this concept for centuries, starting with the resistance against colonization already when the Spaniards entered the Caribbean. You know, there were the leaders of resistance articulated idea of an alternative fuel. To mention just one, the story I like is of the Taino chief who came from Haiti and went to Cuba to warn his people, fellow people there about what the Spaniards are doing. And he was then captured and burnt at the stake. And before he was burned, the Spaniards priest asked him if he wanted to be converted to Christianity. And if he would, he then would go to heaven. Otherwise, he would go to hell and burn till eternity in hell. And then he asked, are the Spaniards also in heaven? And they said, yes, the good one, yes. And then he said that I'd rather go to hell. So already he had the conceptualization of colonialism as this new world civilization that was being brought there, of which he didn't want to be part of. So this is only one of the examples of people who have contributed to decolonial theory. But looking back at the evolution of decolonial theory, what would you say, Ramon, would you consider a starting point?
I always say that decoloniality began when Columbus stepped out of the boat. You know, Christopher Columbus, when he stepped out of the boat. But maybe, you know, we could even go back with the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Castilian Christian monarchy, that, you know, they did a work of conquest against Al-Andalus in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. That was, you know, what today we might call the south of Europe. But at the time, Al-Andalus belonged to Islamic civilization, and it was part of a corridor of a civilization that was rooted in Africa. So it was part of Africa. The south of Europe was part of Africa at the time, and the Mediterranean was not a border between Europe and Africa. It was a river that they crossed back and forth inside Africa. You see, those borders, we need to imagine them completely different than the way we imagine today. And that civilization lasted 800 years. Al-Andalus, you know, and that civilization was very important worldwide. And, you know, remember that Christendom Europe was basically an impoverished, isolated, obscurantist place in the world, you know, because of the Christendom. I didn't say Christianity, I'm saying Christendom. When the Christian ideology became state ideology, and when they transformed the theology of Christianity, especially Constantine, the emperor of Rome in the 4th century, and they transformed the theology, and that's Christendom, that's not really Christianity. And that transformation in the theology from Unitarian Christianity to Trinitarian Christianity was a very important move for a cosmology of turning Christianity into an ideology of domination or a religion of domination. And that was, that happened in the 4th century, but it carried on for centuries since then until today. I mean, this is the kind of ideology that has been in place as part of colonization and conquest, especially after 1492, you know, with the conquest of the Americas. But the first moment of the European colonial expansion was really to Al-Andalus, the conquest of Al-Andalus. And that moment is very important historically for us, because a lot of the methods of conquest that they're going to be deploying around the world until today were rehearsed there. I mean, Al-Andalus is like a laboratory of methods of conquest and domination. You know, one of them, for example, what we call the Encomienda in Latin America, okay, in the history of Latin America, when they came and colonized indigenous people and they put forward the institution of the Encomienda, that was a form of surveillance of both a form of surveillance of coerced labor, and, you know, because they enslaved indigenous people and put them into forms of coerced labor. But it was a form of surveillance of conversion to Christianity of indigenous people who were put to work by force in the institution of the Encomienda. So that did not begin in the Americas. That began way back in the conquest of Al-Andalus, were against Muslim and Jews fundamentally. And they basically, it is what we call today in the literature, settler colonialism. You know, so the Encomienda is settler colonialism. They basically come with their families, occupy the land, and then the people who are colonized, then they are expropriated from the resources, and then they put to work by force, and then they're forcibly converted to Christendom. You know, those who survive, because usually what they do is that those who resist conversion or those who resist being enslaved, they kill them. You know, so so that happened in Al-Andalus before the Americas. So they brought in these institutions of exploitation and domination to the Americas from the conquest of Al-Andalus. And the other one they brought, to give you another example, is the burning of libraries. You know, the library of, for example, Granada have more than 250,000 books. If you go to Granada today, in Plaza Virambla was the place where Cardinal Cisneros burned the library of Granada that belonged to the Al-Andalus and Islamic civilization there. And if you want to get a sense of the significance of this, is and the civilization and comparison here. Christendom at the time did not have more, you know, the libraries of Christendom did not have more than 1,000 books. Okay, the Library of Granada in Islamic civilization have more than 250,000 books. The Library of Cordoba have more than 500,000 books. So this tells you something about relationship to knowledge. When you see just the number of books in a library, you know, in north of, you know, of what we call Europe today, and in the south of Europe under Islamic civilization. When you compare that, you could see how obscurant this was Europe at the time, that it was impossible for scientists to do science. It was impossible for philosophers to do philosophy. It was impossible for doing any kind of critique to the powers that be and so on, while in Islamic civilization, all this stuff were already institutionalized. And you have a lot of advancements in science, technology, you name it, you know? So, so in part, a lot of the knowledge in the early modern period that Europe got about science, technology, philosophy, including the Greek philosophers, they did not come through Europe. They came through the philosophers of Al-Andalus, who, because the texts of the Greeks were being translated to Arabic in Baghdad, you know, and those texts arrived to Europe through Al-Andalus. And then they start knowing about the Greeks, this mythology that the origin of Western civilization is in Greece. That's a lie, that's an invention they did later to claim superiority, racial superiority to the rest. And that's very well argued by Martin Bernal in his book, Black Athena. Martin Bernal develops the argument there and the evidence of this. He has 3 volumes on Black Athena. You know, I recommend you to at least read the first volume, you know, and so I think that there is a lot in the narratives of history that are basically fairy tales, a lot of lies, a lot of things that are not true, that have moved on into the present and have constituted our common sense in the wrong way, because we have the wrong history. And we believe that history because even people colonized like us, we have, we have internalized those narratives, as if they were true. Remember, the victorious forces are always the ones who rewrite history in their own image and convenience. And we should not forget that, and so part of decolonization is also decolonizing our memory, decolonizing history. Part of decolonization is decolonizing the structures of domination we have today in the world, decolonizing the structures of knowledge and so on. I mean, there's so many things about this project of decolonization that are unfinished or incomplete, and there's a lot of work to do, where, this is an invitation to, everybody to join this, because we are in a civilization of death. Right now, the modern Western civilization is a civilization of death, not only because they have killed so millions and millions of human beings, but also because they're destroying life in planet Earth with this Cartesian dualism. This mythology also that human beings live isolated, here, dualistically, ontologically separated from other forms of life that the West called nature. These other forms of life, the West called nature, they thingify it, thingifying other forms of life and made them objects. And that's needed for capitalism, to turn nature into objects so that they can turn them into commodities, and they can turn them into, they could exploit them, you see. But, with that cosmology, Cartesian cosmology, we're destroying planet Earth because we are pushing outside in a dualistic ontological way, outside the human, what is called nature. And so under that cosmology, every technology that is built around that dualistic cosmology has there the rationality of destruction of life, because you haven't thought about reproducing life. You are just, using technology that do not think about reproduction, but they never think that if you destroy those things there, human life won't survive. They think in this fictional kind of mythology that human life could reproduce itself independently of these other forms of life, meaning that you could destroy them and human life will continue. And this is a fiction that we've been 400 years now of producing technology under capitalism that has as its cosmology a Cartesian dualism. No previous civilization in planet Earth before modernity had that stupidity of having a cosmology that is dualistic, producing technology. Every other civilizations in the past, despite their problems, despite the disagreement, despite whatever critique we can make, despite the differences among these civilizations in terms of cosmological understandings, they have one thing in common. They have holistic cosmologies. That is, they think about the universe and human beings within one single cosmos. They don't think that human life is here insulated, ontologically different from these other forms of life. They think of human life entangled with everything else around you. And therefore, they have this common sense that if you destroy other forms of life around you, you destroy yourself. As simple as that, because you're part of those cycles of life reproduction, and you're not outside that. So if you interrupt those life reproduction, ecological life reproduction, you're killing yourself. Any species that destroy other species is destroying life in planet Earth. As simple as that. That's a stupid, a very basic idea. And the stupid idea of having this dualistically separated is really problematic, because it's just destroying life in planet Earth. So in the previous civilization, they were using holistic cosmology to produce technology that have the rationality of reproduction of life within it. And so this idea that now the West comes and say, oh, we humans are destructive of life. You know, we are human beings. You know, I'm sorry, it's not human beings. Human being has been in planet Earth for thousands of years, and we haven't destroyed life in planet Earth like this civilization. This is a civilizational problem of Western modernity. So the problem of the disaster we're living in terms of life in planet Earth is due to a civilization of death, like Western modernity. And so, we can go on and on about these issues, but these are just to give an idea of one of the many problems that this civilization has put forward and that we need to overcome. Otherwise, we have our days counted as a species in planet Earth.
Okay, so let me go back to the question of how do we explain the rise of decolonial theory and the decolonial movement. And basically, one argument you can draw from your analysis is what our friend Stephen Small calls, for every act of oppression, there's an act of resistance. So when colonialism started with oppression, there were always a resistance there, both theoretically and practically in activism. So decolonial resistance was there from the beginning of colonialism till now. But how come that the last few decades we see all kinds of references to decoloniality, which was not there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? This is my answer. We have to look at how, at some point in time, the resistance against colonialism was influenced by Marxism through the Russian Revolution. When the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, it was a big impetus from people around the world who were oppressed, not only the working classes in Europe and the global north, but especially in the global south, where the national liberation, the idea of national liberation, got articulated theoretically in many cadres of those movements turned to Marxism for answer of how to get rid of colonialism. And then Marxism provided the answers. Marxism had this idea of feudalism and the struggle against feudalism. And some Marxist theories argue that in this colonized world, you had feudal institutions. So the struggle against feudalism was one part. Other came with the concept of imperialism. Lenin came with the concept of imperialism at the highest stage of capitalism, where monopoly capital and finance banking industry tried to control the raw materials in the colonies. So Marxism provided also an analysis of world history, an analysis of how to organize for struggle in the concept of Leninist, Marxist-Leninist vanguard party, how you use revolution as an instrument to gain state power, be it through guerrilla war, be it through mass strike, be it through people's mobilization, but sooner or later, you take state power from the vanguard party, and the vanguard party is then could lead other classes, the peasantry, the petty bourgeois, in the national liberation struggle. So Marxism had a coherent theory. And my idea is that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the whole Eastern Bloc from the 1989 onwards, and the collapse of many of those socialist states, the people were looking for a theory of liberation had to find an alternative for Marxism. And because of that, in the different parts of the world, they went back to the philosophies were already there, of the civilizations that brought about, that were colonized. So in Africa, in Asia, or in the indigenous societies in Oceania, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, decoloniality, then the decolonial movement and the theorists tried to figure out what was there in the theory that Marxism didn't provide. And one of the things was obviously the whole question of race and ethnicity, where Marxism had a limited view with the concept of the nationality, which came about with the experience in Eastern Europe and how to deal with the Jewish population. So the reason why you get this mass movement looking for theoretical answers has to do, in my view, also with the decline of Marxism, and the other aspect is the rise of the rest, the fall of the West and the rise of the rest, where even in China, for example, which is headed by Communist Party, President Xi Jinping brought out a book on the relevance of Chinese classical philosophers for articulating theoretical issues and finding solutions for it. And you see the same, in Latin America, where indigenous philosophy, like in Bolivia, where socialism is combined with ideas from indigenous philosophers. So the thing now is that you have a decolonial theory that's developed from social movement, and then you have a decolonial theory that's developed in the academia. And now in the academia, where you have disciplines of knowledge production, sociology, economics, political theory, cultural theory, philosophy, etc., you see that the idea of colonialism having an impact on all aspects of life, including knowledge production, that brought about this contribution in different parts of the world that basically argues knowledge production was fundamentally influenced in colonialism, through colonialism, because the basic tenets of Western philosophy and particularly epistemology was set up in such a way that it produced concept of superiority, inferiority. It produces the idea of the objectivity of knowledge production. So that's why a lot of the decolonial theory went into that particular aspect, epistemology, which means that the world civilization that was created by the European Enlightenment with basic categories in the different disciplines of science, that there were the critique of the decolonial movement had to be on the core, which is epistemology. And maybe, Ramon, you've done a lot of work on that. Maybe you could expand on that.
Okay, let me say first that there's been decolonial theory in the 16th century, okay? I want to go back because I don't want to give the impression that decoloniality is a 20th century thing, okay? Let me give you just a very few examples, let me say, for example, the fatwa of Sheikh Zainuddin Makdum in 1583 in Kerala against the Portuguese. he wrote a long document about, the struggle about, facing the Portuguese, and it's a decolonial text, that we need to look at it in this way. The Portuguese arrived in Kerala in 1498, and Columbus arrived to the America in 1492. Kerala is this part of the south of India, okay? And so that's one example. Another one is the Nika Mopoua document produced in 1548 by a community of indigenous sages of Tlatelolco, and was composed by 4 Tlamanantinimes. This is the Aztec term, this Tlamanantinimes. Nahuas is the Nahua term used by the Aztecs, that were, basically sages, or how can I say, like elders. Elders, yes, elders, to talk about, that they did a document also in the mid 16th century, and composed of indigenous intellectuals in Tlatelolco, in Mexico, and or the decolonial thinking of the Afro-Colombian resistance in the 16th century. At that time, it was not called Colombia; it was called Nueva Granada, New Granada, in the north of South America, and in the coast of the Caribbean, in the Caribbean coast of Colombia, and they were in Palenque, all these, Afro or African descendants who were enslaved there, and who were producing also all this knowledge there. And we can go on over the list around the world, about all this stuff, just to say that there were already decolonial texts, but there were also decolonial interventions that were not in writing, because they were oral, and that they were, already developed at the time in different cultures of resistance around the world. And I want to put, the center in this long durée, origins of decoloniality in relation to the modern world we live. Not in relation to the Roman Empire or other worlds in the past. It's in relation to this one, where the Europeans have destroyed all the civilization that existed in 1492, and they have imposed their own civilization to the rest of planet Earth, to the point that by the early 20th century, with the demise of the Ottomans, they have covered the whole planet. Now we are in a planetary Western modern civilization. It covered the whole planet. So now, after several hundred years of colonial expansion, they were slowly destroying all the other previous civilizations and imposing this one, okay? And this one is called by indigenous intellectuals all over the world as a civilization, but not only as a civilization, not just an economic system. This is a major difference with the westernized left. This is a civilization. This is not just an economic system. And this is a civilization that has an economic system that is historical capitalism. But it's not, the problem is not reduced to that. It's broader, because we're talking about broad structures of domination. And also these indigenous people or intellectuals, critical thinkers, always call it a civilization of death, because it has destroyed all the previous civilizations. You have killed millions of human beings, and because they're destroying life in planet Earth for reasons I already explained. So now we go into the 20th century, okay? And in the 20th century, I will say that there are two major events that, in a sense, explain the rising of interest to decoloniality, that links to what you were saying. One is 1992. There was a world kind of celebration by the powers that be of the 500 years of the conquest of the Americas, okay? That celebration was in 1992, you know, relative to 1492. 1492 as a foundational date when this civilization, you know, went planetary, okay? They went planetary by crossing the Atlantic and then colonizing and destroying the indigenous civilizations in what we call today the Americas, that at the time had other names. This part of the world had other names: Abya-Yala, Tawantinsuyo, Teotihuacan. I mean, you can go over the names, but even in the names we use today to call geographical territory, you see there the seeds of coloniality. We're using names that have nothing to do with the people who were there, you know, when the Europeans arrived. Okay, so the Europeans renamed the continents, started using names to rename the continents around the world and different places. So a lot of the names we use today were not there, you know, and therefore the identities that we use today also were not there when the Europeans arrived. So we use, they rename or rebaptize the names of the territories, and now the people who are born in those places use those names that the Europeans put to that territory. You know, in fact, before that didn't exist. It was, there were so many identities in what we call the Americas today. So many languages, so many cultures, so many civilizations. And they were not backward, like they said, you know, because later they come with this fairy tale that these were backward civilizations. That's not true. These were way advanced civilization in terms of knowledge, in terms of technology, in terms of material culture, you know, in terms of engineering, you know, of water, sewage, you name it. They were very advanced civilization from that point of view, you know. So I'm using this term to put it upside down because Europe at the time was very, very impoverished, very isolated, very, it was a place with a lot of problems, you know, and very isolated, very obscurantists. They were burning alive their scientists. They were burning alive their philosophers. They were burning alive, you know, women who have ancestral knowledges, you know, accused of being witches and so on, you know. So while in this other part of the world, there was a lot of material development and spiritual development, you know, in the civilizations of the America. And these were not isolated places. I mean, if you try to understand, for example, why, for example, the colonizers arrive here, and then instead of arriving, if it was true what they were saying, that they arrive here, look at the logic of the argument here. They tell us that they arrive here to the Americas. I'm saying here because I'm right now in California. So they arrive here in what we call today the Americas, and they found all these backward people, primitive people, savage people, you know, people that are animal-like, that are living primitive life like animals. This is what they tell us, right? Read the letters of Hernan Cortés or Pizarro. You know, Cortés was the conqueror of what we call today Mexico and Central America. Pizarro was the conqueror of the Incas and Tawantinsuyo, the civilization of Tawantinsuyo in what we call today Peru, you know, that area of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. So when you read the letters they wrote to the Spanish king, where they're not lying, they're just telling you what they're seeing. They were astonished by what they were seeing. There was a lot of wealth. You see, if there was nothing here, they would have just, you know, basically say, oh, nice to meet you, goodbye. And they will go back to the boats and go back, okay? The reason they stay is because they saw a lot of wealth here that they didn't have. And that's very clear in the letters of the people who step out of the boat there, you know, and describe to the king what they're seeing. That's when you get the best evidence, because decades later, they're going to come with fairy tales in order to justify what they did. So then they will say all these narratives that we'll read later about primitive, backward people, all this stuff came later. That came later. And that was for the consumption of the world at large, you know, like, okay, we did this because we came to civilize people, right? We came here, the white man burden, right? We came to see, I'm sorry, the first people who step out of the boat of the colonizers, they wrote letters to their boss, and they explained there what they're seeing, and they were like, they were nothing like that in terms of wealth, in terms of engineering, buildings, material civilization, nothing like that in Europe. Just to get you an example, in the Aztec civilization, okay, in the main city, they have close to 500,000 people. The largest city in Europe did not have 60,000 people. And they were dying of plagues, of all kinds of sickness and diseases because there was no hygiene, there was no sewage and water systems, you name it, okay? Then in those cities, in the Americas, they have all of that developed, all the engineering developed, and the people were not dying of plagues or anything like that. You know, it was 500,000 people. They were able to have those amount of people in a city without people dying of plagues or diseases or stuff like that, like it was happening in obscurantist Europe. You know, they have well-developed medicine, they have well-developed engineering, they have well-developed sciences. The Maya calendar was the most precise in the world, etc., etc. Okay? Now, to come back to the question of 20th century. In 20th century, then, all of these fairy tales are the ones that we are hitting, no? And that became the importance of war historical narratives is that it shaped our common sense. So a lot of the common sense we have in the 20th century is shaped by those lies that they have developed over time to make us believe that they're the most advanced, that they're the most civilized, that they're all this stuff, okay? And this date of 1992, where they were celebrating, look at this, the discovery. The discovery. This term discovery is a racist term. How could you call discovery, discovering a land or a continent or a territory when there are human beings living there for thousands of years before you arrived there? How could you dare to do that? Well, for a simple reason. They will claim that these are inferior beings like animal people, animal-like people. Here where you have the racist concept coming in, and it behind or below this discovery thing is a racist idea, okay? Also, these civilizations were not only more advanced in many ways to what existed in Europe at the time, but they were not isolated. They were not isolated. They have contacts, relations, trade with indigenous people from the Pacific Islands, with China, with Africans, with Muslims. There were all kinds. The Vikings from the north of Europe have arrived here, and so on. There were all these contacts. There were already maps running around about this part of the world, okay? By Chinese, by Muslims, there are maps before Columbus arrived here. By the way, Columbus arrived with copies of those maps. That's how he came this way. The problem is that no European could read those maps, so he thought he was arriving to India. That's why he thought he was in India. He died thinking he was in India. He died like 10 years later, and he thought he was in India. They didn't know they were elsewhere because they couldn't read those maps. If you read the diaries of Columbus, he thought that, when he get to what we call today Panama, and he saw the Pacific, he thought he was in the Ganges River in India. This guy was lost. he was lost in geography. I mean, he was completely lost. He didn't know where he was. He thought he was in India. But remember, the whole thing about the Europeans to get to India was who had the control of the travel or commercial trade with India, you know, and the competition among the European empires at the time was about who had the routes to bring those commodities, because war material production was in India and China. I mean, Europe was very backward. So what they did, this European empire was competing who get the fastest roads to get to that part of the world to bring the commodities and sell them for a profit in what we call Europe today. That was the whole thing. So it was blocked from the East Mediterranean because there was the Ottomans there, there was the Venetians there who were linked to the land trade routes who were coming through the Black Sea. And there were other people, you know, the Portuguese have covered all the coast of Africa, going down the coast of Africa to India. And then the Spaniards have no other choice than going through the Atlantic. And these maps he was seeing, he thought that was India. He was going to India, you know. So this is, all this stuff are fairy tales. So a lot of these civilizations in the Americas were already in contact with other parts of the world. Other parts of the world knew about this part of the world, okay? And the only people who didn't know about this part of the world were the Europeans. So when they arrived here, instead of saying, oh, you know what? Finally, we found out that about this other part of the world that we didn't know. No, here comes imperial arrogance. They say, we discover it. This is the imperial arrogance. Instead of saying, oh, you know what? We came late. Everybody else knew about it. You know, finally, we found out. Okay, and being a little more humble, okay? No, we discover it, okay? And this created this so-called, you know, celebration of the discovery in 1992, created a big, big thing that there was a lot of resistance in 1992 and a lot of public debates about this question about the conquest, colonialism, the so-called discovery, or, you know, this is an invasion, this is not a discovery, from indigenous people around the world. So this created like a major moment of debates, discussions, you know, rethinking of the history we have been told, and so on. And that's when the question about colonization, decolonization came back with a force. Okay, came back with a force, and then there were a lot of people coming back to theorizing the question of coloniality, decoloniality in different parts of the world, you know. And then the other date that we need to also bring into the picture is 1991, which is the end of the cycle of 1917, the Russian Revolution. In 1991, as you know, is the implosion of the Soviet Union. And then there was also a rethinking of, okay, if colonial relations are still with us, despite the end of colonial administration, if the way the world is organized today in its political economy, you know, international division of labor, capitalist international division of labor of metropolitan center and peripheral regions, is coming from colonial history and still with us. So that hasn't been decolonized. If we're still under the concept of the nation state as a form of political authority, okay, that creates more problem than solution, because we know that's a fiction. There's no, this pretension of one state, one people, one identity doesn't exist anywhere. We always have multiple identities coexisting inside one state. So this idea of nation state is just a mechanism for failure, where it's just going to exclude people whose identity do not fit the identity of the state. So this is a mechanism of the coloniality of power, you know, and it works in the hands of racist structures, right? If racism is still with us, okay, from colonial times, with a force, right? If Christendom patriarchy is still with us, you know, that was imposed through colonialism around the world, okay? If Christendom is with us, if Eurocentrism is still with us in the university, in the structures of knowledge production, if, I mean, we go over the, if Cartesian dualism, you know, is still it's the cosmology that produced technology in the world we live. So when you look around, we're still living under colonial domination. We're still reproducing the concepts imposed by the West over the rest. And therefore, if that's the case, how can we transform this, right? How can we go and move towards the foundation of a new civilization beyond this civilization of death? Here comes the question of 1991, which is the fall of the Soviet Union, because that model immediately was used to try to achieve precisely that. So when people were celebrating in 1992, all these states and structure, and there were people from the grassroots questioning this celebration, the question about how to go about transforming this, already because of 1992, the year before, they saw that that could not be a solution because it didn't work. There were problems, Eurocentric problems in the paradigm of the Westernized left that led them to their failure. Because the Westernized left, as you know, always emphasizes on the economics and forgets the civilizational aspects, right? Here is when, this is the context that I think produces this, how can I say, this like fuel for suddenly all these decolonial literature critiques, etc., debates, because suddenly we were discussing how colonialism is not over, how the so-called discovery is a myth, this is racism, how the structures of coloniality are still with us, despite the end of colonial administration in most of the world. And then how we go about transforming it, that was the question, right? In a way, that was the paradigm that was used until that time by national liberation movement, which was Marxism, as you said, did not work. It had problems, right? In 1991 is that date, that year, that's end that cycle. The people in 1992 now thinking about what we do with this monster called Western modernity as a civilization of death. Now they have gone through the experience of the failure of Marxism. And here is when the question about, okay, let's look back into our different epistemologies to see if we have a toolkit there that could help us rethink the way we go about transforming the world. And here is where you have then an effervescence, the risings, of this return to different epistemologies around the world because of the disillusion with Marxism. Let me just say before, and I'm ending here, that Marxism, when I say Marxism, I'm not including Marx here. I'm saying Eurocentric Marxism. Socialist movement in 20th century and national liberation movement both use this paradigm that have nothing to do with Marx himself, okay? I am a follower of the work of Enrique Dussel, which I consider, if not the most important, one of the most important decolonial philosophers in the world, who has done a work, 5 volumes, based on the published and unpublished manuscripts of Marx. And he shows very clearly that what we call Marxism in the 20th century have nothing to do with Marx himself, because there's hundreds of volumes of Marx in the last 20 years of his life, where he's questioning his own Eurocentrism. It's in his own theory. But a lot of these volumes are not published, and the few that are published haven't been translated yet. So I'm saying this, for example, Capital, we're reading like the second draft of Capital, and Marx did 4 or 5 drafts of Capital, the 3-volume work of Das Capital, no? And there are like 3, 4 manuscripts more where he corrected a lot of things of this second version, which is, we read the first volume that Marx published in Life, but later he revised a lot of that. And so we don't have access to all this stuff, and so I'm saying this also to call attention that we need to disentangle Marx from Marxism, Lenin from Leninism, and Mao from Maoism and so on, because there are many things in those authors that were Eurocentric, but there are things that could be useful for a decolonial project, that we cannot throw away. But we need to disentangle these persons, these intellectuals, critical intellectuals, as historical figures from the followers. So Leninism is not Lenin, Maoism is not Mao, and Marxism is not Marx. We need to reread that tradition in a different way too, so that we don't throw away the baby with the water, okay? And then we have in front of us then, basically a moment. I think this is the moment when we have in the last 20 years, 30 years now, 30 years now, this effervescence of decolonial writing and coming back to these questions with a force all over the world, not just in Latin America, all over the world. We see this coming. Some people use the term decolonial, colonial, etc. Other people don't even use that. Other people are talking about the West and Western civilization and disentangling from that, etc., with other language. So we need to be also very careful not to discard people who are doing decolonial work, without using necessarily the term decoloniality. Okay, and that was more or less.
All right. So let me summarize this session, where we go into the question: what explains the rise of the decolonial movement and decolonial theory in the past decades? Now, before we go into the explanation itself, it's important to register that there was always have been decolonial theory and decolonial movement as a response to colonialism from the very start, right? So people have produced ideas about the different civilizations, about the critique of what they encountered with Western civilization being imposed on them. But having registered that, we can conclude that the resistance against colonialism after the Russian Revolution find in Marxist philosophy and Marxist theory an answer to the question of how to fight colonialism. And the answer was theoretically in the whole apparatus of Marxism, philosophy, historical materialism, economic theory, political theory of the state, etc., and also in how to take state power and transform the society. And with the demise of the Soviet Union and the way 500 years of colonialism was remembered in 1992, you get people who are arguing for liberation theory outside of Marxism. Right? So in the social movement, this articulation found form in all kinds of things with the label decolonizing. Decolonizing the university, decolonizing the school, decolonizing culture, decolonizing museums, decolonizing food, decolonizing all kinds of labels. And in the academia, it found a theoretical construction, the concept of decoloniality, and basically in philosophy, starting with epistemology. So let that be the second, the subject for the second talk of us. Thank you, Ramon.
Okay, thank you very much.